Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So, the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know, and feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support. Welcome back to Utopias. Our next guest in an interview recorded in January of 2024 is a dear friend and colleague of mine, Nathan Schneider. Nathan and I met in 2012, actually, at NYU, and I was on my way to Egypt as I was writing about the wave of revolutions that were occurring in the Arab world and the connections these had to technology. And we had such an inspiring conversation, and we stayed in touch ever since. And I found out just, several months later that Nathan was really one of the founders of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which also started in the around 2012, late 2012. Nathan is actually now an assistant professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He studies technology, democracy, and religion. And he's one of the main figures out there exploring how the internet and internet platforms could be better supportive of communities, meaning communities of users, but also communities of workers. So in that space, he's one of the real trailblazers of a field that we call platform cooperativism. Imagine a Facebook where, all of us were supported by the wealth and revenue and investment capital that went into Facebook. Imagine an Uber where the drivers own some small amount of equity in Uber. This is really what Nathan is a major pioneering figure in figuring out how this can happen and giving tons of examples of what already exists. So he's exploring democratic ownership and governance of online platforms and protocols. He's the founder of the Media Economies Design Lab. And we talk extensively about democracy in the internet, democracy in technology, and really what a future will look like where we all truly are in it together, if you will. Nathan is the embodiment of a Utopia's podcast guest. He truly believes in repair, care, and creativity. So this is just a great, great conversation. I'm super grateful for Nathan's work and his insights. So everyone enjoy this one. Thank you. So grateful and honored to be in conversation with Professor Nathan Schneider from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. It all comes back to utopias for me. Thank you for having me, Ramesh. It's so good to be with you.
And let me also start by just giving you an opportunity to tell us about your new book that's coming out before we go to kind of your early influences and inspirations. I'm really excited to read your new book, Nathan, and I love your work. I've been really engaged with it over the last several years. So tell us about it, who's publishing it, how we can get the book. I'm going to be getting copies of the book for my classes.
Thank you. It's called Governable Spaces: Democratic Design for Online Life. And after February 27th, 2024, it'll be out free and open access at the University of California Press. And you can also get it in print with full color illustrations by Daria Medic, who's a brilliant artist and thinker and scholar. But this book has meant a lot to me. But at the same time, it's, in some respects, a challenge to communicate about. It's about democracy and the internet. But most of the time when people hear that, they think, oh, what is the internet doing to democracy? Like democracy is something outside of the internet, that the internet's ruining or helping or something. What I'm interested in is the democracy in everyday life on the internet, and especially the lack of it, the ways in which we've failed to practice and design the tools we need to practice everyday democracy. And it builds on this long tradition going back to people like Alexis de Tocqueville, as well as anti-colonial scholars like C.L.R. James, who saw democracy is only possible through its everyday practice, that you can't do it at the largest scales unless you're doing it every day in some way. And I take their analysis, their legacy, and turn it on that everyday life in our online spaces. And it's a I hope it communicates in some way the deep hope I feel and possibility I feel for um, what we could do with these online spaces, in making them not just kind of sites of doom scrolling and flame wars, but sites of discovering our dignity in new ways, and finding our power.
Really excited to read the book. It's super cool that that there's going to be a free version. It's really true to your ethics, Nathan, that there's going to be a free version available for everybody to read. And that gives me an opportunity to like kind of start by asking you a little bit about, this book and its relationship to where we are at. We know our lives increasingly are being expressed by datafication. Basically like almost anything and everything we do, there are digital footprints. There's data associated with it, right? Numbers associated with it, often collected by and for private corporate platforms. And I'm literally, saying this, mentioning this to you after getting off the phone with the reporter from the New York Times who's asking me about the 23andMe, the company that collects genetic data to kind of tell us our own genetic ancestry, has had major data breaches and associatedly a major class action lawsuit. So our lives are being re-expressed through data more and more, and often those brokers or holders of such data are private corporations. Sometimes it's also states like the National Security Agency and so on, right? So our lives it seems like are increasingly being experienced online. I think we all know that. So it's so important to kind of inject democracy into actual life, rather than kind of assume life and democracy exists outside of technology and the way it mediates our lives, right? So that gets me to the question of, what do we mean by democracy, or what do you mean by democracy, right? And what are the major steps that can be taken right now? Because there's a lot of light that you have, Nathan. I've known that about you and felt that about you for many years. You're someone much like myself who like wants to do things, makes things happen. Let's look at the utopia and let's as a North Star and move toward it. So what do we mean by democracy, and how do we start to inject that as a certain kind of animating spirit, set of values into our digitally mediated lives? How do we deal with that?
Well, I hope you'll forgive me for backing up a bit, because, to answer that question, I think I want to go back to where we first started talking, and that was around the social movements in 2011. I was running a website covering social movements at the time. I ended up doing a book about Occupy Wall Street called "Thank You, Anarchy," and the part I focused on, the part that I kind of fell for at the time as a journalist in what was going on there, was not so much like, would this movement reverse wealth inequality, or reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act, or these kind of specific economic policy demands. The thing that really grabbed me about it was the practice in the squares, what people were doing when they came together in these occupations, not only in New York, but around the country and around the world, drawing on what people were doing in Egypt and Tunisia and Spain and Greece and beyond. And that was a desire to push democracy to its limits, to practice a direct democracy in how these movements operated, that for many of the participants in some ways started to feel more powerful than just winning a policy game. And I was really struck by that. And the whole, my work around those movements was puzzling with that challenge, with that question: what is going on here? What are people longing for? At the same time, these movements were driven by by social media platforms, by data, by these emerging networks that were just starting to really take the shape that we now know them in. And what I saw was a kind of disconnect, that the networks allowed the movements to spread and grow and get their message out. But they could never handle or hold or carry the practices of democracy that were happening in person in the squares. And once the squares were gone, once police kicked these activists out, there was no like durable infrastructure from all those viral messages that people had produced. You had some accounts with lots of followers, but you couldn't get out a message really about a meeting or update them on the boring things that social movements need to do. And so it just became very clear to me that not only is our data caught up in interests that are not ours, but actually the design and texture of our social and political lives in these spaces are being organized in ways that are not ours and that are not really enabling us to build power in durable ways. People, were cultivating forms of decision making and of hearing each other's voices in ways that just did not translate into online spaces built for advertising, essentially. And so that kind of set me on a question. What would it look like to have spaces that were actually built for social movements, for democratic practice, for the kinds of things that people seem to be craving in those squares, and that led me on my next book after that on the cooperative movement, efforts to bring democracy into the economy, into spaces of business, into workplaces, which many of those activists went into, and then now to me it's going back to in some respects to the basics. Why is it that these winded we end up with these designs that come to seem so deeply inappropriate for democratic practice, and out of that try to figure out how can we build these spaces differently, how can we reimagine them and take a different path.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we met in, I believe it was 2011, believe it or not. So it's 12 plus years ago, 13 years ago, something like that. And at that time, I was learning about and being inspired by the wave of democratic protests that were occurring all over North Africa and the Arab world, the so-called Arab Spring, and in my case, I was looking at at how people were trying to overthrow dictatorial regimes backed by the United States government in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, and at that time when we met, you were the sort of light of Occupy Wall Street, wave of protests, occupying public spaces, and building kind of a direct democracy that also started to take root right at that time. So for those who are listening who were like little kids at that time, a lot happened just recently, right? A lot was happening just a little over a decade ago. So tell us a little bit about Occupy Wall Street, and also this point you made that there was a direct democracy there, and that's something that's quite different than certainly where online media, which can spread information, but we also know can divide us, and we don't know who gets what information and what the terms of such are. So let's talk first about the power of that direct democracy, about you all occupying, squares, public spaces in and near Wall Street, and that's spreading all around the world. And so, what do we mean by direct democracy and the power of people actually physically coming together, rather than letting our democratic communication be taken away from such by just blindly turning to these platforms?
Yeah, direct democracy is a kind of alternative to what is more familiar in our society, which is representative democracy, where we choose somebody to represent us and then they make decisions for us. Direct democracy is any system in which the agents themselves, the sovereign people themselves, make the decisions and participate fully. And in some ways, it's a utopia. It asks more of us than we probably can give. But in those spaces, there was a kind of turn. Initially, I covered the early planning meetings that led to Occupy Wall Street, and the initial call made by a magazine called Adbusters was Occupy Wall Street on September 17th, 2011. What is our one demand? Essentially, what should we demand of power? And the people who were in those meetings, a cluster of kind of anarchists, artists. The artists were really, really central, really, really key. Also, labor organizers and people have been around, doing this or that, and were one way or another drawn to this call. Were there, and they, especially again, the artists helped reshape this idea from, hey, we're just going to ask something of the government to, we are not going to ask something. We are going to make this occupation a vision of the world we want to see, and we're not going to keep trusting these representatives. We're going to do this practice ourselves. So every little decision as the occupation took hold, became subject to this general assembly where hundreds of people would gather in a square. They'd echo each other's voices because they couldn't use amplification. So someone would say something and then other people outside would repeat it in what they call the people's mic. And the goal was always, how can we maximize each other's and our own freedom and our own voice? There was this beautiful chant that would sometimes come up, that was, "We the people have found our voice." And that was the kind of palpable feeling in much of that period for me, was this sense that that thousands of people were coming into these spaces. They were contradictory, messy, difficult spaces in many respects, but over and over, I heard people say, "I have never felt heard the way I do here. I've never felt like this before." And I felt, I was a reporter. I was trying to be a reporter here, but I would leave the occupation, go somewhere else in New York City at the time, and the rest of the world would just feel like less real than what was happening in this weird little utopian bubble there. And I was just struck by that, the feeling that you're in a space where you are a kind of fuller citizen than you are, in the world beyond. I mean, it took me back to, my work on religion, my, kind of personal connection there, this sense that, when in the book of Acts, when the Christian church is first founded as people gather after the ascension of Christ, like they talk about signs and wonders and holding all things in common, doing all these really utopian things, and it kind of felt like that. It felt like suddenly those words made sense to me in ways they hadn't before, and that's, of course, that's going to be a fleeting feeling. You can't always trust your enthusiasms. But it did point for me to something, really, really deep. It pointed also to experiences that I had, growing up, participating in local government, helping to change a policy around my school, and that sense of power that one can have in moments like that. They can last for years. They can give you a sense that, hey, there is a path forward, even when you see the system breaking down all around you and failing. Hey, we know that something else is possible, and that's what those glimpses can do. And for many people, I know, who were in that movement, who were in the movements in Spain and Greece and Egypt, that experience shaped their lives in a really indelible way. And when I think about democracy in online space, I'm interested in how can we enable more people to have that kind of experience, that kind of utopian glimpse that also leads to a lifetime of patient democratic practice, pragmatic practice as well. And that connection between the utopia and the real is something that I'm always wrestling with in my work.
Well, maybe the utopia is what motivates the real to become a different real and kind of a shifting real, right? Like the real is what we create together, like you all were creating together, in starting with artists, anarchists, activists, labor organizers in Zuccotti Park in Wall Street, ends up spreading all around the planet, and where many, many people who may not even identify with those particular groups, like I'm not an artist, I'm not an or labor organizer, but I'm down with Occupy because it's all of us coming together to make decisions about us, about what power could look like if we all directly, hence the term direct democracy, had such, right? So, as you know well, we have a presidential election coming up and many other elections, of course, that we shouldn't just only talk about presidential election, national representatives, in some cases, Senate elections, of course, local school boards, mayoral, etc., state elections, state reps, state assembly members. All of this is happening, right? And these elections are for representatives who are supposed to represent our so-called direct democratic voices, right? But we know now quite well that not only do we have the electoral college, which actually elects the president rather than actually us, even it's not our popular vote that matters. That no, it matters, but it doesn't actually directly determine the results. But also, it seems like many of these representatives in this so-called representative democracy we live in are influenced by factors outside of the votes of their so-called constituents, corporate power, lobbyist power, plainly speaking, corruption. Um, so, so if we look at the direct democracy on the one hand, which is the power of bringing people together, which can occur through faith, through unions, through many different modalities, right? Through amazing movements like Occupy occurring, through the movement for Black Lives occurring right now with protests for a ceasefire. Very, very important. We see that those movements occur, but then we see this sort of corruption in terms of those who actually are supposed to govern and represent our direct voices. How do we make sense of that and overturn that? How do we even begin to do that? Because, with Occupy and even the movement for Black Lives and other movements, there's often the critique, and I saw it personally with the Arab, with the Egyptian revolution. People say, well, look at it, those in power are even worse than it was before, or nothing really happened after the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, the murder of Michael Brown, and just on and on and on. Nothing changed. That's what people say. And therefore it breeds cynicism. But you and I have so much hope, partly because we have participated in these direct democratic kind of movements. But then I understand people's sort of not cynicism, but their sort of sense like this doesn't change anything. So what do we do about that?
First of all, that sense of the movement's failures. I mean, it's more than just like they didn't change anything. Actually, I mean, the record of 2011, alongside the record of the legacy of imagination that it left, has been devastation. I mean, look at Syria, Yemen, Egypt, now Tunisia, and even like the current politics in the United States. But particularly when you look at the Arab world, those protests, opened up a door that led to civil wars that are still smoldering. We really have to own that. We have to recognize that we cannot have a Pollyannish view of what happened there. And again, it comes back to that question to me of the power we're able to hold in networks, because each of these movements was deeply tied to its digital networks and deeply emboldened by them. I still take so much from I think a brilliant analysis by Zeynep Tufekci, the media scholar, in her book Twitter and Tear Gas, where she distinguishes signal and capacity. The movements were able to broadcast signal through these networks, but the networks did not give them the durable capacity to really build the political power that they need to make long-term change. And that, to me, is why the capacity question goes to the heart of why we need to be able to self-govern on these networks, because if we don't, somebody else will. And we need the ability to build not just political message, but political power. And we really don't have that, and it's been profoundly deceptive in as a result. The the question of the decay of democracy, I think was very palpable in those moments. That sense that you do not represent us, was another slogan, that time. That sense that the systems as they've been conceived in the late 1800s and the 19th century, that we've inherited, are just no longer working. The good news, something that was again deeply palpable in those movements, was the sense that democracy is not just the current institutions we have. It is an ongoing process and is something that we have to be constantly evolving. This is something Alexis de Tocqueville, writing about American democracy in the 1830s, understood. This is not a new idea. And there's so many different ways of practicing democracy that can address some of the challenges like the ones you talked about. One thing that is really motivating and inspiring for me in this work is people who have been developing new approaches to practicing democracy, even in the context of governments. So, for instance, participatory budgeting practices that emerged out of Porto Alegre in Brazil many years ago and have spread up to the global north, now in Europe in particular, as well as in East Africa. There's a lot of experiments going on around citizens' assemblies, where rather than choosing representatives and, erring on the side or opting for the people who are loud and self-important enough to think that they should be representatives, instead picking people at random and having them come into a space together and become experts, get paid, learn about a particular topic, and develop ideas for how to move forward on it. This has been a really powerful movement that has helped some societies get through some of their biggest challenges, some of their most kind of deadlocked political issues. For instance, adopting new constitutions, passing reproductive rights in Ireland, confronting the climate crisis in France. A number of cases, and a growing number of cases, are being addressed this way. So, but still, governments are always going to be slow, and in many cases, the governments are reluctant to hand power over to these entities, and that's why I think there's such an opportunity in digital space to remind ourselves that democracy is an ever-evolving thing, is something that we can experiment with much more fluidly. We can try stuff out, and we can look back to the past in new ways. One project I'm working on with a group of collaborators is called Governance Archaeology, where we're trying to gather and map legacies of governance that pre-exist the digital world, that are in collaboration with indigenous communities, that are legacies stewarded by communities who are not normally looked to as as the kind of as political theorists, but who really should be, and to recognize the wealth of legacies that we have to draw on, and the possibilities that democracy could be, rather than mistaking, the defense of democracy with just making sure the Supreme Court or the legislature or whatever is protected from money. We need to recognize this is a tradition that has to evolve, and the best defense is offense. I think the only way to keep this democracy thing relevant and fresh and accountable is to allow it to change and take ever evolving forms.
Democracy is a North Star, a way as a certain kind of vision where all of us share power and articulate power together through dialogue, through directly communicating with one another, through being in the same spaces, whether they're online or not, to really sort of deeply recognizing that together we can create something that is representative of all of us in different ways, and knowing that there's an incompleteness to democracy. I love all of that. That's really, really helpful because for all of our listeners, when we think of democracy in the United States, it's not simply reduced to sort of bowing to the Electoral College. It could be about implementing participatory budgeting, which means all of us together make decisions on what the budget should be. Should the U.S. budget over 50% of our taxes go to the military and private corporations, including technology corporations that are military contractors? Like, should that be? I would guess the vast majority of Americans would say no. I also would guess that the vast majority of Americans and actually people around the world would also say, you do not represent us, which was literally the call from Occupy you mentioned. I love that. So democracy is sort of a container of lots of different ideas and proposals and movements and possibilities and practices. See it as a North Star. A lot of younger people in the US and perhaps in different ways around the world feel dispossessed, right? Understandably. And we've talked about this before. First generation, at least in the US and also the UK, to make less money than their parents, even if you control for inflation. Life expectancy decreasing in the country. It seems, there seems to be a lot of insecurity in terms of access to dignified work that was sufficient to pay um, us, especially younger people entering labor markets, sufficient wages to live a life of dignity, let alone with healthcare or housing and these sorts of issues. So many younger people feel cynical when they look, when they kind of think of democracy as this choice between, two, around 80-year-old men who are very tied in different ways to hyper corporate interests, including military interests, right? So what can we share? What can you share with our younger listeners and viewers about how they can get involved, what they can do, how to move out of a feeling of disorientation and dissociation, where some even have come to me in my classes over the years and said, I don't really know why my parents had me. Like, I don't know what is this world? It doesn't seem to be one for me. And therefore we have mental health issues and so on. So how do we what are ways to reinvigorate that and recognize that that they actually can and should take power, and how can they be inspired to do such? Like, what can they do, and how can we kind of support that as faculty, but just as activists ourselves?
I think it starts with changing the subject a little bit, changing the subject from a media environment that looks at everything nationally and imperially. The whole world has to stare at our screwed up national politics, to say nothing of those of us who live here in the United States and don't get much attention focused on our local issues that we actually have some power over. I think the starting point is to get out of this kind of spectator sport of politics, where we are just watching, we are just fuming, we are just commenting and liking and unliking and whatever it is, and move into spaces that we can self-govern, move into our own political spaces. De Tocqueville talked about civic associations, the kind of clubs, unions, co-ops, churches, other communities of worship, whatever it is, as schools of democracy. And let's ask, are we practicing, are we exercising our democratic skills in our daily communities? Those are the sites that keep me going, that give me hope, and that are also tools for practicing things that we can exercise at larger scales as well. In the start of this latest book, Governable Spaces, I talk about my mother. I mean, so there was a point where I was trying to run an online, massive email list, and there were some problems, like usually happen on the internet, and and I didn't really know how to address them in an appropriate way as the person that had the full administrative power over this list. And then meanwhile, my mother was telling me about her garden club where she had just been elected president. And this is like a group of women who live near each other and are interested in gardens. And they hang out together and contribute to the community and stuff like that. But they have like bylaws. They have rules for how to address problems. They have this little handbook, and it has the most kind of boilerplate bylaws you could possibly imagine for any small organization. There are thousands and thousands of organizations with virtually identical structures, but it means that my mother, when she was president, was accountable to those rules. She had a set of guidelines for how power flowed in that organization that we tend not to have in our online spaces, certainly. And then we don't take them into our offline spaces either. I think those things like a garden club with bylaws and elections and stuff like that are deeply important sites of practice and also sites of hope. Not to say that that garden club is going to end authoritarianism tomorrow, right? It's not. But I think, when I look at the kind of discourse that we see around us today, I see a lot of people who've lost hope, who also have never really felt like they had a voice. And when you actually have the chance to hold power or to give power in something like a garden club or like an online community or in the context of a conflict, and you can see a process working in a way that you can trust, and you see yourself as accountable to others, and you feel others' accountability to you. You behave in larger politics differently. You recognize, when somebody makes a compromise, it's not because they betrayed you. It's because compromises are part of life and is part of being part of a diverse society, right? You don't enter into that space trying to rip it down. You enter into it recognizing that there's something really precious there, and let's find a way to participate. Recognizing the value of what we have inherited, as well as the recognition of what needs to be changed. And to me, those little spaces, again, not I'm not trying to say that we need to retreat into our little private worlds, but that actually those local communities, whether they're physically local or digitally local, are the starting point of our hope, of our mental health, of our ability to be truly true political subjects. And whether we use the word democracy or not, like I think it can be. I use it a lot, but I think it's kind of it's an endangered word. Maybe we need other words, but one way or another, we need to feel that. We need to be able to practice that stuff tangibly before we're really equipped to participate in democracy. In this kind of hyper mediated onslaught that we so often inhabit.
Yeah, in a sense, it's like you can actually get a lot of like positive energy and inspiration and momentum by actively participating in democratic organizations of all types, whether they're like online communities that are about trying to fight racism, or climate related organizations on our university campuses or in our schools, or attending a protest, or really working with and trying to influence even your local city council person. There's all these different ways. So in a sense, what I hear from you is that it's not for younger folks as well, many who are on social media a lot, right, from TikTok to Instagram to what have you. It don't see those as sufficient. I think most people on these, or younger folks on these, tell me, I'm on there to get information, but I know that it's not really uplifting my life or giving me any power to change things as it stands. So instead, there's other ways to come together to try and which is really good for our mental health, because then we recognize we're not alone and that we can create things. It cultivates creativity, cultivates care, cultivates community, right? And that can create some momentum, that can create a range of different types of changes. That's how I sort of take what you're sharing with me, Nathan. Is that on point?
Yeah, and but to do that, we have to be intentional.
Tell
And
us some of
that's
the how
part
can
of
we
the
be
warning of
intentional?
the book. Yeah, it's the warning here is that we've entered into spaces that are designed against democratic practice, right? That are actually they're designed, as you said or at the beginning, talking about, the flows of data, they're designed to get us to flame out at each other in order to disclose more about ourselves. Never about, there's never a nudge on, an Instagram thread or something like that to say like, hey, have you considered like how you might have some common ground with this other person? Or, if you were to imagine a consensus emerging in this conversation, what would that look like? That's never the prompt, right? Um, and to give a counterexample, so for instance, there's this platform called Mastodon. It's an open source social media platform. Um, you know, about 5 years ago, I was part of a group. We did a shareholder proposal at Twitter, trying to convince Twitter to become community owned. We got it on the ballot. We had a lot of fun. We got a lot of, noise out there, but when it ultimately failed, we said, okay, we're gonna set up our own space just to create the utopia of the social media we want. So set up a server running the software in Mastodon. It connects to other servers, kind of like email, except with a social media interface. And but we set it up intentionally as a cooperative, which means it's co-governed by the people who use it. We all put in money. It's very cheap, but there's an expectation that we're all contributing to the server costs and stuff like that. And through that, over a long period, for me, it took some years before it really became like the main place that I go on, for when I'm looking for a feed to look at. Because it took practice to cultivate, took work, it took relationship building. But the result has been my favorite social media experience of my life, one in which, I know a lot of the people in the space. The broader feeds that come in are kind of collectively curated by the people who are on the server together with a set of roughly shared values. And it's just a very different kind of experience. And we had to, intentionally create bylaws and create some committees and assign people to make sure that, moderation is happening and conflict resolution is happening. All the stuff that you would do, like if you were gathering together and sharing a physical space. That point is something that I think is really deep here is the exceptionalism of online spaces, that we actually treat them very, very differently than we do any other kinds of spaces. And one person I turn to a lot in this book is Adrienne Marie Brown, who's an activist and thinker and philosopher around Black liberation and queer liberation. A lot of the most vibrant movements today are looking to her as a guide. And Brown is just amazing in how she's a great social media influencer. She's got a big following on Instagram. But she talks about how she compares what goes on there to the physical, the meetings that she facilitates in her practice as an activist, and sees how people behave online. It's just like, we would never tolerate that stuff in the spaces that I hold and facilitate. I would never hold these practices in those online spaces. We can't control them enough. The way in which she sees that conflict, that contrast between her practice as a responsible facilitator of communities and the crazy stuff that happens in online space, what she calls, the call out culture, the stuff that's allowed to spread in these online spaces is just like, it is a kind of amnesia. It's a kind of forgetting of how we, would otherwise behave when other human beings are sharing space with us. And And I think a lot of that in some respects is by design. It's trying to turn us away from the slow and accountable work of self-governance. It's trying to turn us away from the expectation that, everything, local decisions should be made locally, things like this, and instead hand power over to those platforms. What we lose is not just, an abstract sense of our data or potential income that maybe we should have from the value we're creating, or discrimination, but we're losing that ability to actually have control over the daily things in our lives, um, and counteracting that does require intentionality. It requires us to actually go out there and make sure that not only are we sharing a space, but we have some ground rules, that we have, that even the people who hold power are accountable to somebody else. That we do some design, to make sure that we're integrating, our deep and broad and diverse democratic legacies into how we organize the spaces we inhabit.
It sort of brings up this, a scenario that I think all of us can relate to, every single person, which is, whether we're in a classroom or in a supermarket, like physically, or in a church, or in a synagogue, or in a mosque, right? Or at a public assembly meeting, we have certain rules and understandings and norms of how to treat one another. And partly we don't necessarily want to treat one another, or that desire to treat one another horribly and insult one another is maybe not as present, because we're like physically with one another, and there's something humanizing, there's something grounding, there's something humbling about that. So if you compare and contrast that with being online, whether it's TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or any of these mega corporate platforms, right? That where there's supposed anonymity, right? Like we even know that many accounts are bots on these platforms. Literally, they're bots, and including the former president, many of his followers back when he was, the Mr. Twitter. There was estimates that a significant percentage of the former president's followers were bots. So it's sort of like everything is about hiding, right? Everything is about hiding. And also, many know that the best way to get traction and visibility and in a sense monetization is to be as insulting and outrageous and divisive or untruthful. The absence of the kind of vulnerability and intimacy of actually putting yourself in physical space. Just as a kind of stupid example, very LA example, Los Angeles, where I live, is it's very, very different. So maybe it's my like Indian background, but in India, when people are driving around, they're constantly interacting with one another all the time. From the horn, which drives some of us who are Western or partly Western like me crazy. It's a social space driving around, and it's extremely crowded social space, versus here in Los Angeles, people can be very, very aggressive when they're driving. If the cars are, because everyone's hiding in their cars, and tinted windows and so on. So when I drive, actually often in LA, I roll my windows down, and I actually like physically actually not like physically touch people, but I like wave to people. I say hi, hey, can you let me go? Or yeah, you go ahead. And it's sort of, and I notice every single time that creates people are way more willing to be, hey, you can go, or I can go, or thank you. And it's just, I think that's something so important that's in what you're sharing with me, Nathan, which is the absence of actually connecting. Like, these connectors are actually not connecting us in the way that connection actually functions, which is about being present, having rules, working with one another, giving and receiving, listening and sharing, right? And so there's something very different. So here's the question, right? Going back to your bringing up our beloved colleague Zeynep Tufekci's work in Twitter and Tear Gas, who she's now also a columnist with the New York Times, um, is what do we need to do online And what have you been doing online? Because I know we're looking at this for years to make those online spaces more like going to an assembly in the school or the local, kind of city council meeting or, a church going situation or what have you, like what was happening at Occupy Wall Street. So this is beyond political categories, right, left, whatever it is, this is more about actually coming together. How can online we actually come together? Does that mean there should be an absence of anonymity? Doesn't mean, what should it be like cameras on all the time? Like what do we need to do? Coming up with ground rules in advance? What if people don't follow those rules? Is it about, having the public own the platforms or them be cooperatively owned so that private corporations are not monetizing attention and addiction and polarization? I don't know. There's just a few things.
Well, first, forgive me for getting really abstract again, but because of the name of the show, when you're talking about the cars, right? I was reminded of this classic book of libertarian philosophy, Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia from the '70s, right? Which makes a very, I think, powerful claim that there is no true utopia. The only utopia is a world in which there are many utopias, and you can choose among them and go from one to another. And I think it's a really powerful statement in some respects, in that sense that it is true. Like we want pluriverses, right? Is a better way to say it. A world in which many worlds fit, as Zapatistas put it.
Yeah, the
But
Zapatistas says otro mundo es posible, another world is possible, but they also say many worlds are already here. Say both,
right,
So think
right.
about that. Another world's possible, but actually all those worlds are right around us. Yeah.
And the kind of libertarian ethos that has driven like the development a lot of these tech spaces is very much of the Nozick kind. It's not a world in which many worlds already are, and in which we have to make those worlds work together. It's kind of more of a world in which you should be able to exit whenever you feel like it and have no accountability to anybody else. And that's that's a way of being that we learn in these spaces where leaving a group or unfollowing or whatever is just a click of a button away, where there's very little incentive to really invest in each other, and to feel that longer accountability, that we're inclined to atomize. We're inclined to treat our communities as an on or off button, and if you don't like it, you leave, rather than if you don't like it, you work to bring your voice into it. And so that's a kind of initial imagination that I think what I'm very interested in is how big ideas have actually been woven into the software, that we now take for granted, and have set the norms that we now take for granted and don't question. So how do we counteract those in practice? One side of that question is at the level of small communities and where we find ourselves. And this is the approach that I call governable stacks. So this is, how do we build our relationships to technology in our communities, where we can't own the whole thing. We can't govern the whole thing probably, but we can start inserting practices of self-governance into them, being intentional about how we collectively control things. And, one example of this that, I talk about, that social.coop group, that social media group. Also, another community I'm part of is May 1st Movement Technology, which is offers server space and email. It's what I use for my personal email and lots of other stuff, file sharing. It enables me to get off of the corporate tools for a lot of the stuff I do day to day, and rely on tools that we co-govern as a community. And we have annual meetings and all that stuff. So we make, those intentional steps, not purity tests, not, you're in or you're out, but intentional steps. There's similar project among techies in India to build feminist servers. They call them, buildings, shared digital technology with feminist ideas at the heart of how we manage resources. So there are these ways in which we can start to, one step at a time, make choices that enable us in our communities to co-govern and have control over our technology. But there are really limits to that. And so the next phase that I think is also really important is at the level of policy, which is to say, what rules do we impose on these systems? How do we expect to set the boundaries? And what I argue is that a lot of the policy, the public policy that we've done, as well as technological policy, is it assumes top-down control, what I call implicit feudalism. It assumes that okay, if there's a problem, that CEO has to fix it. And if the CEO can't fix it, then the government needs to fix it and tell the CEO what to do. It's always a top-down flow. All right. And there are reasons for that around corporate structure and all this sort of stuff. What I argue for is that we need to start rethinking how we do problem solving in online spaces with the assumption that problems should be solved from the bottom up as much as we can. And that, for instance, do we have problems with labor rights and work? Well, give workers more power to organize and formulate their demands. Do we have problems with people, with moderation in online spaces, with dealing with hate speech and this sort of thing? Empower the communities that are confronting those things head on, to take those on in contextual ways. Enable them to make their own decisions. And what we find in a lot of experimental cases so far is that generally actually works really well. Enable people to have real problem solving tools. I think, for instance, a lot of what goes by the name of cancel culture or call out culture is actually just a symptom of the fact that we don't have good conflict resolution mechanisms. Like if somebody says something really hateful and harmful on an online platform, you send it into the company, you never hear anything, you have no idea what happens. The tools that it can use is either just censorship or exile. There's no sense of restorative or even transformative justice that becomes available there. There's no way for people to present their claims in a way that can be resolved in a meaningful way. And these should be our expectations. In the same way that when you start a new town, you set up your local school board, you set up your local courts, you set up your local city council. We should expect that online space should be locally governed as much as possible, and allow us to use democracy as the problem solving mechanism. When you try to do everything all in these uniform solutions, one size fits all, it's never going to work. It's never going to solve the problems. When you instead create tools that enable people to solve different problems in different ways in different contexts, it becomes solvable. It becomes addressable. We know this from every other area of human life, and we just have not really applied this in the ways we need in online spaces.
I mean, part of it is just sort of turning local, like working with your own physical community, thinking about technology not as a way to displace you from where you live or who lives around you or what you can actually physically or what have you, like, work to resolve, but actually think about technologies as ways to bring, for example, people here on my street together to deal with a particular issue or to hang out together. Right. It's a reminder of how, for example, Facebook itself, not the corporation, but the technology, was sort of built upon particular college campuses as a way to sort of like hone in as a technology. And that's sort of part of what allowed it to develop traction. And now we know, if anything, it's sort of an extractive system that pulls us and disinforms us and disorients us. But we can look to the past, right? We can even look to the past of how the internet and the web itself, first and foremost, started with online communities that had certain norms and values around how people could and should share with one another. And so there's there's something more graspable, I feel, in all of that.
But I wouldn't want to be like a physical maximalist right there because yeah, I mean some of the most important communities for me, one of the great blessings of the internet for me is like, I go through my day, talking with people all over the world and building, community with people all over the world. And that's a it's no substitute for the work you do so well of going out and being in places for long periods of time, and that there is it's not the same as that. But what I'm interested in is what the indigenous scholar philosopher Glenn Coulthard calls non-exclusive sovereignties. A world in which land networks overlap, and there are different kinds of sovereignties and different kinds of spaces in which we co-govern, and they're not all reducible to a fixed border. I mean, to me, in some respects, like this work is all, is kind of implicitly a war on borders, on this idea that there is one line that we have to respect. And yes, we do need like the physical local to govern things that are important to the physical local. But I also think there's a need to create to recognize the beauty and power of our digital local, our many digital locals, and the fact that we are entering modes of multiple citizenships, not just in terms of national citizenship, but our ability to work through networks as a kind of site of sovereignty, as the place in which we can be full people. And in some respects, I think that might be the only thing that can save the nation state, if anybody really wants to. Right now, the too much pressure is on the nation state. We're trying to get these nation states to solve climate change and fix economic inequality and fix the internet, and none of these things a nation state is actually well equipped to do, because these are global problems. These are problems that spread much further, and I wonder if maybe the deep pathology of the nation state might be at least lessened if it became less important, if there were other sites where we could participate in co-governance in politics that have nothing to do with where we live, that relate to other aspects of ourselves, of who we are, how we situate ourselves on this planet. And so, in some respects, this call for governance in online space is, in some respects, it's a very mundane thing about everyday life, but in other respects, it is about transforming our sense of where sovereignty occurs and what political spaces we should be caring about. Maybe a nation state that had less pressure on it would be able to actually solve territorial problems and get on with the business of life, rather than continually performatively making promises it can't keep and leaving us disappointed and cynical.
Yeah, really important because it's often, I think we think of our choices as one of either, okay, get involved in your physical local community, or get involved in your like government or your nation, or this sort of like TikTok, Instagram, online world where we're sort of shouting into the wind and in these weird, silos and bubbles and so on. But maybe there's this other space, which is really what you're working on, and where communities that exist online are places where we can have sovereignty. Sovereignty meaning sovereignty can be expressed in a lot of ways, but it's sort of about power and voice and accountability and governance of all of us. So think of, for example, I'm just thinking out loud, like, and I would love an example of this, um, like an online movement or community that tries to engage with, the problems caused by electronic waste. That's just sort of a random example that I sort of interface with a little bit. You know, what could it or would an online community look like of people from all around the planet who are together devoted to such a cause, and how would that community function? How would it be governed? Who owns these networks? what are the protocols and values associated with with that community? Community can be expressed in lots of ways, as you said, non-overlap, non-exclusive sovereignty. Like sort of like we're parts of many different kinds of communities. We have, right? Like it's like it's like I'm not just part of one community, I'm part of many communities, and my voice can be different in different communities. So I love that. I wanted to just ask before I turn to sort of the final part of our conversation today of some examples of these kinds of online communities that we can encourage people to look at or pay attention to so they can see that the online world doesn't have to be a world of sort of social media driving us apart from one another, dominant corporate social media. What are some examples that we can look at?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's always worth asking, what examples do we have in our lives that predate the internet, right? For instance, I am an inheritor of some medieval European legacies. I'm a member of the university guild system, right, which was developed in the late Middle Ages and is this kind of international network that has pretty shared standards wherever you go, a lot of familiar logics and practices and habits. And it's not very territorial in many respects. It's a trans-territorial citizenship that I inhabit. I'm a member of the Catholic Church, a form of citizenship that is that predated the nation state and doesn't really still know what to do with nation states. And has these are in no way utopias. These are profoundly contradictory and deeply flawed institutions, but still they are sites of connection and practice and carry legacies that I think are very worth considering. Monastic orders, have this kind of practice of, a shared identity where if you're a nun or a monk living in a monastic order, you care a lot more about the rules of your order than you care about the laws of the nation state. It's the rules of the order that you're living by, not the nation state, right? So those legacies are important to remember, and are all around us in their remains, and they deserve, I think, a deeper attention again. Um, in terms of the online communities today, I one thing that I deal with quite a bit in this work and in my work in recent years is the world of blockchains and cryptocurrency. Not because I love this stuff. It's stuff that I got involved in very early, always, was engaged in a very critical engagement with it, very worried about what it could lead to. And a lot of those worries have come to pass. But at the same time, what it has enabled is it's a kind of network that actually produces that sovereignty. It's a network that requires being governed by the people that use it, just in how it's designed. And as a result, it's forced people to actually invest in producing technology for self-governance. There's, in the last few years in that world around crypto and blockchains, there have been a ton of platforms developed to enable different kinds of decision making and self-governance, and a lot of new kinds of decision making and self governance that the world had never seen before. Different ways of counting votes and balancing like economic interests versus like people interest, and different interfaces that enable like ongoing decision making and direct democracy rather than representatives. And so very ambivalently, I think it's something, even though I think many people rightly are like, enough of that stuff. I think there's a lot of lessons from that experience about how different kinds of network designs can open the door. But more mundanely, I look at communities like, for instance, an archive of our own, which is a platform, a website for fan fiction writers, where the fan fiction writers tried all these other platforms. They kept getting kicked off or running up against weird rules, and we're like, enough, we need to have our own. And so they created a platform where they could write fan fiction that they could control and that they could govern. or Ravelry, which is like a platform for people doing knitting work. That's an incredible community-driven site that is grew through the community, not through venture capital, anybody trying to make a ton of money. And talking to the founders there, it's just like it's driven by the people who love doing this work. And they are trying to figure out how can we make sure that this is accountable in the right places. And these little things point to the tendencies that I think we need to amplify. They're not gonna, they're still marginal, and I don't want to claim they're anything else. And what I think we need is a shift in our policy structures, in the way we allocate resources in our societies to give more air to those kinds of things, and less air to the extractors.
Yes, exactly. And one legacy, I don't know how directly you wish to tie this to the legacy of Occupy that I was personally involved in, was the campaign of Senator Bernie Sanders, both in 2016 and 2020, where in both cases was a major challenger to the Democratic Party establishment. And I guess the reason I'm mentioning that is a big part of that campaign was the idea that the internet could be used as a way to reach, everyday people who might give $18 to support the campaign, could self-organize in their own local communities with other kind of Bernie people, and the data was not to be used, to in sort of shady ways. At least those were the principles sort of behind that campaign. And I guess the reason I wanted to mention that is that does get to one of the, you mentioned the capacity of online spaces to reach many everyday people, so to speak, who could align around communities like caring about knitting or breast cancer survivors or faith communities that exist online. All of, are many different examples of this. Back in the day, back in the 20 around 2010 and around that period, there was a lot of there was a sense that the internet could bring the crowd together, like everybody could participate. There was even a book called "Here Comes Everybody" by Clay Shirky, that was sort of extolling the virtues of this. And so I'm not trying to necessarily frown upon that work as much as sort of get to that question of, there's something also extremely powerful about how online spaces can build so much capacity if everybody can participate just a little bit. What is the legacy of that? Because in a way, there's so
Yeah.
many more of us than just a few kind of investors and executives at these corporations, and together we all have power, right? And I wonder about that still to this day.
Well, to me, the short answer is a tyranny of structurelessness. Is this classic essay by Joe Freeman on feminist politics in the early 1970s and late 60s, where she reflects on these activist groups that would form, and they'd be like, hey, dude, we're just hanging out, and everything's cool. And then in the background, like a couple of guys would be running the whole thing, and they'd just be like, hey, this is all of us together, here comes everybody, right? And but they're still running the thing. And that's the story of the internet, right? Is the sense of like, hey, we're not going to create a power structure. It's a decentralized network. Anybody can be here. And oh, by the way, we're going to get all, a few of us are going to get all the money over in the corner over there, right? And that's what has happened. That's how our platforms have been designed. It's a deep problem, for instance, I think in the open source movement, which has avoided questions of governance in many contexts, and as a result has allowed itself to be captured. This powerful anti-commercial, movement of software development and for the common good has been captured so much by corporations because, they didn't really clarify who is in charge here. And I think it comes back to, those social networks in Occupy. We ended up in those movements with a lot of tyrannies of structurelessness where, because there was not often a clear structure of power, a few people with a loud voice would end up, taking that power. And one platform, for instance, I think of that also came out of Occupy, that was a kind of direct response to that moment, is called Action Network, and it's used by a lot of political campaigns now. It's partly funded by the Democratic Party, but one thing I really appreciated as a platform, and I use it for my own personal newsletter. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting counterpoint to Substack, which is designed to just feed the kind of conspiratorial imagination. Instead, uh, uh, Action Network is designed around the ladder of participation, a kind of classic activist concept of, starting people at one level and then moving them through the process of engagement, in fuller and fuller engagement in an activity. And that's something that, I think a healthy political campaign does. Is it's something that says, yes, you can click, you can be a collectivist, but let's make that a step into something else and help you get involved more and more with everything you do. And when you're designing a newsletter in Action Network, it's always nudging you like, hey, are you getting them to write a letter? Are you getting them to sign a petition? Like, what's the next step? What's the next stage? Are you targeting and making sure you're speaking to the right people with the right message? And it's that kind of design is what can happen when you build technology for building power, not technology for evading the question of power, for a tyranny of structurelessness. And in some ways, all I'm calling for, in some respects, is let's put the flows of power, out on the table and ask, is this really what we want? Do we really want all of our groups to be controlled by mods, like volunteer mods who are overworked and who have too much power, and we have no accountability to them? Do we want these companies controlled by CEOs who aren't even accountable to their shareholders? And that old idea from before the internet of the tyranny of structurelessness, explains so much, but it also invites so much. It invites us to remember legacies that are, buried deep in our subconscious, that are part of our communities, that are part of, our many legacies that we inherit, and to bring those, to catch online space up, with the richness of what we have and what we could do, so that online space can also be an opportunity to be even more creative and continue to explore the undiscovered possibilities of democracy.
Yeah, like giving us lots of different options, lots of different ways to relate with one another, lots of different ways to be part of community. From, sure, you can click, sure, you can give $18, but here's all these other ways you can get involved. Here's ways where you can get involved in this particular part of this community that you care more about. Here's some ways you can be involved in setting some rules. Here's, just it's kind of like, I think what you're doing so powerfully, Nathan, in all of your work over the years, as I've read it, is you're lifting the hood off of this sort of like fatalistic, kind of looking into the, this sort of feeling like we're just talking to the wind, that this online world is just sort of this, dumpster fire. It's like, instead you're like, wait. Remember like what makes you human. Remember what makes you part of a community. Remember what makes you like creative. Remember what makes you care. These are all things that like we have some connection to, with or without technology. Let's make those the design principles of any sort of technology or online space, right? And that's really important, and it's really tied to a utopian vision, because it's moving us more and more toward a vision of what we wish for or what we care for, sort of another North Star in its own right. And one thing that's very, very unique about you amongst my colleagues and friends and fellow folks connected to activism and true democracy with technology and more, is your own connections to Catholicism and your ongoing connections as a Catholic. And as you know, religion can be a way of isolating us and maybe fundamentalizing ourselves. But I know in your own life from a very young age, Catholicism if I'm not mistaken, has been very important to you. And I guess I wanted to ask you to kind of sort of share whatever stories you wish about the connections you see between being a practicing Catholic, a member of of orders and churches, and a church and so on, and your own kind of space as an activist and as someone kind of in the weeds with this technology and making technology democratic. Like, how are these things all connected for you? And I know you wrote your first book also about religion.
Yeah, no, that first book is about proofs for the existence of God, and that was because at the time, I was when I was a teenager, I converted into the Catholic Church, and the opening for me was actually a monastic community. It was a monastery near where I lived, and
Can you tell us
I
which monastery where? Like, it would be so nice to hear about this.
yeah, it's a monastery in Virginia along the Shenandoah River called Holy Cross Abbey, um, and they invite they invited me in. I went there kind of out of curiosity, and somehow they let me stay with them, like in the community as part of them. Before I had even come into the church and all this, and it was a great gift, but it also, a few things that this journey has taught me. One is, I came into the Catholic Church. I felt this call that was, you know, a call I couldn't say no to. At the same time that the sex abuse crisis was breaking out in Boston with the Boston Globe revelations, and that was 45 minutes away from where I was at the time, and so I've always walked with this church with this recognition that this is not a perfect institution. This is a profoundly conflicted and even dangerous and destructive institution. It's and traveling in Latin America, you see those contradictions, for instance, very visibly. The colonial church, the syncretistic practices where people are trying to keep their pre colonization traditions alive within the context of Catholic practice, and it's a site of conflict and contradiction. And I had to accept that early on, and that I think was an important lesson for me in being able to understand what democracy has to be and what institutional life and community life has to be. We cannot just wait for the perfect utopia. We have to build within what we've got. We have to build where we are. We have to, sometimes we do have to leave, but there are other times when we do just need to accept this thing is never going to be perfect. And yet we have to find some grace in there. The other thing that early experience, the most powerful moment of that early experience. I mentioned that these monks let me into their space. I was living in their cloister. I was, living in a cell just like they were. I was singing in the choir, and the one thing they wouldn't let me join them for was what's called chapter, and that's the moment after the Sunday service when the community comes together and discusses the business of the community. And this is an ancient democratic practice. This is spelled out in the rule of Saint Benedict, which was written around the fall of the Roman Empire. This is democracy was not invented in the 18th century. Sorry, and it wasn't invented by the Greeks, and it wasn't. It has so many sources and so many sites of practice, and that was the moment where they said, we actually can't have you here because we're worried that somebody might not be as honest if an outsider is in the room. Attention to, and I was really like shaken by that. I was really, for some reason, that just hit me really hard. That the preciousness of that moment of self-governance, even over, the prayers to God, it was so important to them that they wanted to keep that for themselves. And that to me is just, I hope that, what I long for in the work I do now is to enable people to have those kinds of spaces, those kinds of experiences, where they feel heard, where they have a space where they can feel, safe to participate and to have their minds changed and to shape their community, to blend. They blend obedience, and obedience is a profound virtue for them too. So the voice is mixed with obedience in this really, really challenging way, where they have a space to speak, but they also have to abide by whatever the community ends up with. And this is just there's so many different kinds of stories one could tell from so many parts of the world where these legacies are still lurking in plain sight, where these precious practices of self-governance, of voice, of hearing, of respect. And I just, we need those so desperately. We need those so desperately. And we're so much in danger right now of forgetting them, forgetting that we can be so much better than we are on our worst day on the internet.
So true. It's like wherever we can feel really part of a community. Being part of a community is part where it gives our voices have power in our communities, but we also have to respect others. We also have to come up with rules, but also follow them, right? Together. We want to change the rules. We together change those rules, right? It's like really getting back to those basics. And in many ways, in many different faiths, there are examples of communities that continue to this day, from Catholicism to Jesuit communities to, I'm part of various sanghas as a practicing Buddhist myself, and etc. On and on. And these communities don't have to be about disconnecting from the wider planet or other communities. They can be about renewing a connection. And I think that's just an important clarification I want to make. Many of the scholars you mentioned are from indigenous to queer to Black feminist, etc. Their practice from these perspectives is not about disconnecting from deeper humanity or the deeper planet or life itself. It's actually a way of injecting an animating sort of spirit that sort of checks imbalances in power, so that actually, the good is, as the Zapatistas say and many other communities, we're not just doing this for ourselves. This is sort of like where the wider planet can go. And I think that I've seen that with with Catholic friends of mine, Jesuit friends of mine, friends who are really parts of communities of faith. And so I really appreciate that a lot. So I have just a final question for you. And this has been really amazing. You're always very inspiring for me. And you have that sort of, like our guests on Utopias, you're like fit that so well, because our guests all have a sense of, let's be creative, let's care for one another, let's care and repair, right? Like that, it's really about care and repair. So, you've alluded to this, but if you sort of have certain, where things might go in the future, both for you personally, for the values you stand for your own practice as a scholar, an activist, a journalist, a million other things, a father, what have you sort of learned about yourself as you have done this sort of, I don't know if the word is work, but have gone through this path and are continuing to go through this path? And where do you wish for? Where is your kind of utopia moving toward? Like what is your utopia moving forward for yourself, for all beings?
I thank you so much for this, and it's just such a joy to be not only with you but also in the wider conversation with the extraordinary people you're bringing in. But to me, it comes back to experience. I hope that everybody on this earth, if they want to, has the chance to experience their own power in community, in their political lives, in their social lives, has the chance to experience that combination of being with others, but being heard, being able to trust the communities that they're in. And, and I think about how much my own early experiences where I had a few lucky chances to really experience that, and how much those have given me the motivation and the faith to work on, to think that democracy is actually possible. And also it reminds me of a meeting I was at once with, room full of kind of grab bag of social activists around the world or around the country, around the US, back in those Occupy days. It was a bunch of people trying to figure out where do we go next. And it was this really, really weird meeting in a hotel in Pennsylvania. And everyone kind of introduced themselves. And there were all these like older folks who I'd known their names and whatever, but didn't really know in any way. And the thing that struck me most was many of them told stories of an early glimpse of success, an early glimpse of their own power. Usually stories I'd never known before that, are not part of their public persona, but it just made me realize, oh, this is why you do it. This is why you've committed to a life of social change, because you were touched by, an experience that clarified for you that a better world is possible, because you saw it happen in some tangible way. And I just think those experiences are so powerful. They're more powerful than any idea. They're more powerful than any manifesto or vision. And I hope we can create those for each other.
It's a really powerful answer, it's like the positive momentum, the positive energy that's sort of generated by having experiences of being part of community. I think you've given us, a lot of heart, a lot of spirit, a lot of creativity, that are reminding us that we all have that, right? In addition to our minds and our intellect, that we can just start, hey, let's volunteer with this organization, join, have engage more with one another in the classroom, try the same thing online with particular types of communities rather than sort of relying on, as many of us know, we know better at this point, rely on Instagram or TikTok to create community for us. Create that positive momentum of recognizing that we're beings that relate to one another. And sometimes we need to be alone, but we do need to relate to one another. We need to be part of our sanghas, our communities, and so on. And that the digital world can also follow that path, and it must follow that path. And you are one of the most important people helping make that happen. So I'm just really grateful for you as a friend, as a colleague, and thank you again for joining us on Utopias. It's only the first of many conversations we have over the years. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Ramesh. Be well.